There is a moment, precise and unmistakable, when the mind chooses to withdraw from everything, not to escape the world, but to survive it. Have you ever noticed that instant? I am Carl Jung, and I spent my entire life observing what happens when a human being finally falls silent before the constant noise of relationships, expectations, and the masks carried since childhood. What I discovered is that this silence, this withdrawal so many fear, is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a healing that can only happen far from the eyes of others. Most people confuse solitude with failure. They believe that if they are alone, something has gone wrong, that they have failed to maintain the bond society insists on calling success. But I will tell you an uncomfortable truth. While you are surrounded by voices, opinions, presences that demand from you an edited version of yourself, your psyche has no room to breathe. It remains trapped in an endless theater, performing a role it never truly chose. And it is precisely when you withdraw, when the external noise finally ceases, that the true architecture of your mind begins to reveal itself. This video is a journey through 7 psychological stages I traced across decades of studying the human soul. We will speak of the fall of the persona, the inevitable encounter with the shadow, the liberation from complexes that still command your reactions, the signs of synchronicity life begins to show you, the awakening of the self, the archetypes that reshape how you see the world, and finally, individuation, the moment you return to yourself, whole for the first time. If you have made it this far, part of you already knows you are about to meet yourself. 1. The persona begins to fall. Every day you spend surrounded by others, you are quietly rehearsing a performance. From the moment you wake and step into the presence of family, colleagues, strangers on the street, something within you shifts into character. You adjust your tone, soften your opinions, exaggerate your enthusiasm when none is felt, and swallow reactions that might disturb the fragile peace of the room. This is not deception in the ordinary sense. It is something I came to call the persona, the mask the psyche constructs to negotiate its passage through society. But a mask, no matter how necessary, is still not the face beneath it. Constant companionship, constant visibility, demands constant performance. When you are never alone, you are never off stage. Every interaction requires you to calibrate yourself against the expectations of whoever stands before you. The version of you your mother needs to see, the version your employer rewards, the version your partner has grown comfortable with. Over years, this calibration becomes so automatic that most people no longer notice they are doing it at all. They believe the mask is simply who they are, because they have never experienced a moment without an audience to perform for. This is precisely why isolation carries such psychological force. When the audience disappears, so does the necessity of performance. In the early hours of solitude, something strange happens. You reach for a familiar expression, a practiced way of responding to a feeling, and you find there is no one there requiring it of you. The muscle that has performed for so long suddenly has nothing to push against. And in that empty space, for perhaps the first time in years, a different question arises quietly in the mind. Who am I when no one is watching? The answer does not arrive immediately. It rarely does. What arrives first is discomfort, even a kind of vertigo, because the persona has occupied the seat of identity for so long that its absence feels like disappearance rather than revelation. But this discomfort is not damage. It is the necessary friction of dismantling something that was never meant to be permanent. Jung understood the persona as a tool, useful, even essential, for functioning within a collective. The danger was never in having a persona. The danger was in mistaking it for the totality of who you are. Social identity and authentic identity are not enemies, but they are rarely the same substance. Social identity is built from repetition, from what earns approval, from what avoids conflict, from what has proven again and again to keep you safe within the group. Authentic identity is built from something else entirely, from impulses that arise without an audience, from preferences that persist even when no one applauds them, from reactions that surface honestly rather than strategically. Most people spend so much of their lives inside the first that they lose all familiarity with the second. Consider how differently you speak when you know you are being observed compared to when you believe you are entirely alone. Consider how your posture changes, your vocabulary softens, your laughter adjusts itself in pitch and timing. None of this is necessarily false, but it is curated. And curation, sustained long enough, becomes exhausting in a way that is difficult to name, because it operates beneath conscious awareness. You do not feel tired from a single performance. You feel tired from an entire life spent performing without permission to stop. This is what I meant when I warned that an excessive persona leads inevitably to psychic exhaustion. The energy required to maintain a false coherence day after day, year after year, draws from the same reserve that should be available for genuine living, for creativity, for depth, for rest. When that reserve is constantly diverted toward performance, the individual begins to feel a fatigue no amount of sleep resolves, because the exhaustion is not physical. It is the exhaustion of a self stretched too thin over too many masks. Withdrawal interrupts this pattern in a way nothing else can. It is not merely rest from people, it is rest from the requirement of being perceived in a particular way. In solitude, the muscles of performance slowly release their tension, and something beneath them, quieter, less rehearsed, begins to surface. It may feel unfamiliar at first, even foreign, because it has been so rarely given room to exist unfiltered. But its unfamiliarity is not evidence of its falseness. It is evidence of how long it has been buried beneath necessity. What emerges in this space is neither dramatic nor immediate. It is closer to the quiet realization that certain opinions you held were never truly yours, that certain enthusiasms were borrowed to please, that certain silences you kept were not peace but suppression. This realization is uncomfortable precisely because it exposes how much of daily life had been organized around avoiding exactly this kind of clarity. The persona does not want to be seen as a mask. It wants to be mistaken for the face. And so the falling of the persona is not an act of destruction, though it may feel like one in the beginning. It is the necessary first collapse that clears space for everything that follows. Before the shadow can be met, before the self can be heard, before individuation can even begin, the mask must be allowed to slip. Not violently torn away, but permitted, in the stillness of withdrawal, to simply stop being necessary. This is the first quiet revolution of solitude, and it is only the beginning of what the psyche has been waiting patiently to reveal. 2. The encounter with the shadow. Once the persona begins to fall away, silence does not remain empty for long. It fills almost immediately with everything that performance had been holding at bay. This is the moment I have always considered the true threshold of psychological work, the encounter with what I called the shadow, the sum of everything within us that was too dangerous, too shameful, or too inconvenient to show the world, and so was pushed down into the unlit regions of the psyche. The shadow does not disappear simply because it goes unseen. It waits. Silence is precisely what disturbs its hiding place. When the mind is constantly occupied with other people, with obligations, with the endless management of appearances, there is no quiet long enough for suppressed material to surface. Noise is a kind of anesthesia. But withdraw that noise, sit alone with nothing to perform and no one to please, and the anesthesia wears off. What was numbed begins to ache. What was buried begins to rise, often without warning, often at the most inconvenient hour of the night. This is why so many people, upon finally being alone, report a flood of emotion they cannot immediately explain. Old resentments surface with startling clarity. Fears long dismissed as irrational return with new weight. A rage you believed you had forgiven reveals itself as merely postponed. None of this is regression, it is retrieval. The psyche is finally safe enough, quiet enough, to bring forward what it could never risk exposing in the presence of an audience that might judge, reject, or misunderstand it. I want to be precise about what the shadow contains, because it is often misunderstood as something purely evil. It is not. The shadow holds whatever the conscious personality has refused to acknowledge as its own, and this can include anger, yes, and envy, and cruelty, but it can equally contain suppressed strength, denied ambition, buried creativity, even a capacity for joy that felt too dangerous to express. The shadow is not the opposite of virtue. It is simply everything exiled from the story you have told yourself about who you are. When these exiled parts surface in solitude, the immediate instinct is often to flee back toward company, toward distraction, toward anything that might drown the discomfort out again. This is precisely the moment that determines whether transformation will occur or be postponed once more. The temptation to retreat from the shadow is enormous, because meeting it honestly requires admitting things about yourself that the persona spent years concealing from others, and more importantly, from you. But I have observed across countless individuals that those who remain in that discomfort, rather than fleeing from it, discover something unexpected. The fear, once faced directly rather than avoided, loses much of its power. The anger, once acknowledged rather than denied, reveals the wound beneath it. The insecurity, once named rather than hidden, becomes something you can finally work with, rather than something working on you from the shadows, unseen and unchecked. This is the paradox at the center of shadow work. What you refuse to face controls you precisely because it remains unconscious. What you bring into awareness, however uncomfortable, becomes something you can finally hold, examine, and integrate. Integration does not mean acting on every dark impulse the shadow contains. It means acknowledging that these impulses exist within you, understanding their origin, and choosing, consciously, how much power to grant them, rather than being driven by forces you refuse to name. A personality that has integrated its shadow becomes remarkably more stable than one still performing an unbroken image of goodness or composure. This is because the energy once spent suppressing, denying, and hiding these parts becomes available for something else entirely. There is a particular kind of strength that only emerges once a person has stopped pretending certain truths about themselves do not exist. It is not the strength of someone without flaws. It is the strength of someone no longer at war with their own psyche. Isolation, then, is not merely a pause from other people. It is the beginning of an internal confrontation that society, with all its distractions, makes nearly impossible to complete. In constant company, the shadow remains manageable because there is always something else demanding attention. Alone, there is nowhere left to look but inward, and this is uncomfortable by design. Discomfort is the signal that something long avoided is finally being addressed. I have come to see this encounter as the true beginning of transformation, not the discovery of the self which comes later, but the necessary confrontation that must precede it. You cannot build a stable identity on a foundation with unexamined rooms beneath it. The shadow must be met, however unwillingly at first, before anything authentic can be constructed above it. Every person who has undergone genuine psychological change has passed through this uncomfortable threshold, often alone, often in silence, often at an hour when there was no longer anywhere else to hide. What follows this encounter is not immediate peace. It is something more valuable, a kind of honesty with oneself that cannot be achieved any other way. And it is only once this honesty has been established, once the shadow has been acknowledged rather than exiled, that the psyche can begin addressing what lies even deeper, the old wounds and patterns I call complexes, which have been quietly directing your choices long before you ever noticed their hand upon the wheel. 3. Trauma stops, controlling you beneath the shadow. In a region even less visible to ordinary awareness, live what I called complexes, clusters of emotion, memory, and belief organized around a single wound, often formed decades earlier, often in childhood, and often entirely forgotten by the conscious mind, even as it continues to direct behavior from beneath the surface. A complex is not simply a memory. It is a small autonomous system within the psyche, one that activates automatically whenever something in the present moment resembles, even faintly, the original wound. This is the disturbing truth about old experience. It rarely stays in the past where it belongs. A childhood in which affection was conditional creates an adult who reads rejection into ordinary silence. An early experience of abandonment creates a grown person who panics at the slightest emotional distance, regardless of whether that distance carries any real threat. The choices these individuals make, who they pursue, who they push away, what they tolerate, what they cannot bear, are rarely conscious decisions. They are the complex speaking disguised as personal preference. This is why so much of adult life feels, to the honest observer, strangely repetitive. The same type of partner appears again and again, wearing a different face each time. The same argument recurs across entirely different relationships, with entirely different people, as though the individual were somehow attracting the identical wound repeatedly. This is not coincidence. It is the complex seeking familiar terrain, because the unconscious mind, however painful the pattern, finds the known more tolerable than the truly unknown. Ordinary life provides constant stimulation for these complexes to remain active. Every crowded room, every relationship, every professional interaction carries the possibility of triggering old material, a tone of voice that echoes a parent's disapproval, a moment of being overlooked that revives childhood invisibility, a disagreement that awakens the old fear of abandonment. In constant company, these activations happen so frequently that the individual never has enough distance to notice the pattern itself. They experience only the emotion, never the architecture producing it. Withdrawal changes this considerably. When the stimuli that typically trigger a complex are removed, even temporarily, the nervous system has room to settle. The old alarm, so accustomed to sounding, finally has a period of quiet in which to be examined rather than simply obeyed. This is often when a person, alone for the first time in a long while, begins to notice something they had never permitted themselves to see clearly, a pattern connecting seemingly unrelated events across years, even decades, of their life. Recognizing a repetitive pattern is a delicate process, because the mind resists it. There is a strange comfort in believing that each painful relationship, each professional disappointment, each moment of rejection was simply bad luck, an isolated event unconnected to anything deeper. To see the pattern is to admit that something within you, not merely circumstance, has been steering these outcomes. This admission is uncomfortable, but it is also the first genuine step toward freedom from the pattern's grip. I have always insisted that what remains unconscious will be experienced as fate. This is nowhere more evident than in the repetition of trauma. As long as the complex operates outside of awareness, it will continue directing choices that feel, in the moment, entirely free and personal. Only once it is brought into consciousness, examined honestly and understood in its origin, does its automatic power begin to diminish. The wound does not vanish, but it stops steering from the dark. This is the essential difference between being controlled by trauma and having survived it. A person still governed by an unconscious complex reacts to the present as though it were the past, defending against dangers that no longer exist, punishing people for wounds inflicted by someone else entirely. A person who has done the work of recognition responds instead to what is actually occurring, because the old alarm has finally been examined closely enough to lose its automatic authority over the present moment. Isolation offers something rare in this process, enough stillness to observe your own reactions rather than simply living inside them. In the absence of constant triggering stimuli, you begin to notice the moment just before the old reaction fires, the flicker of fear, the surge of anger, the impulse to withdraw or attack. This flicker, once invisible, becomes visible precisely because there is finally enough quiet to catch it before it becomes action. Healing does not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrives gradually, in the moments when an old trigger appears and, for the first time, does not command the same automatic response it once did. This is what I mean when I say that healing begins the moment trauma stops directing your reactions. The wound remains part of your history, but it no longer holds the pen writing your present. And it is precisely this quiet reclaiming of authorship that prepares the psyche for what comes next. A growing sensitivity to something larger than the personal past, the strange and meaningful language of synchronicity. 4. Synchronicity begins to appear. There comes a point in withdrawal when something curious begins to happen, something that defies the ordinary logic of cause and effect. A name you had not thought of in years surfaces in your mind moments before it appears in a message. A question you have been quietly wrestling with finds its answer in a passage you happen to open at random. A stranger says, in passing, the exact sentence you needed to hear. These moments arrive without invitation, and they arrive with a weight that ordinary coincidence does not carry. I gave this phenomenon a name: synchronicity. Synchronicity is not superstition, nor is it simple chance, dressed up in mystical language, I defined it as a meaningful coincidence between an inner psychic state and an outer event, one that cannot be explained through ordinary causality, but that carries unmistakable significance to the person experiencing it. The mind and the world, I came to believe, are not as separate as modern thought insists. There are moments when the inner and outer align, not because one causes the other, but because both seem to be expressions of a deeper, shared order. Why does this alignment become noticeable only now, in withdrawal, when it was presumably always occurring? The answer lies in perception rather than in the frequency of the events themselves. A mind occupied constantly with noise, obligation, and performance has no spare attention with which to notice a meaningful coincidence, even as it passes directly before it. Synchronicities are quiet by nature. They do not announce themselves loudly enough to compete with a life filled with distraction. Only a mind that has slowed sufficiently can register their presence at all. This is precisely what solitude provides. As the pace of external life recedes, internal awareness sharpens in a way that is difficult to achieve through any other means. Thoughts that would ordinarily be lost in the rush of the day begin to linger long enough to be noticed. And when a thought lingers, and something in the outer world unexpectedly mirrors it, the coincidence no longer slips past unnoticed. It registers. It demands attention. It asks to be understood. I want to be careful here because synchronicity is often misunderstood as a promise that the universe grants wishes to those who wait quietly enough. This is not what I intended by the concept. Synchronicity does not necessarily deliver what you want. It delivers what is psychologically significant, which is often something you did not consciously realize you needed to see. A confirmation, a warning, an invitation toward a path you had been avoiding out of fear rather than genuine disinterest. The increased frequency of these experiences during withdrawal is not evidence that reality has begun behaving differently. It is evidence that you have begun perceiving differently. The world has always been full of pattern and coincidence. What changes is your capacity to notice the meaningful ones among the countless meaningless ones, a capacity that requires precisely the stillness that constant company makes nearly impossible to sustain. There is something deeply reassuring and at times unsettling about this heightened perception. It can feel in certain moments as though life itself has begun responding directly to your inner state, as though the outer world has become a mirror reflecting back the questions, fears, and hopes moving quietly through your psyche. This sensation should not be dismissed as delusion. It is, in my understanding, a genuine indication that the boundary between the personal unconscious and the surrounding world is thinner than ordinary consciousness assumes. For someone who has recently confronted their shadow and begun disentangling old complexes, synchronicity often arrives as a kind of quiet validation. It suggests that the internal work being done in solitude is not occurring in isolation from reality, but in a strange and subtle dialogue with it. A coincidence that once would have gone entirely unremarked now feels like a message, not because the universe has suddenly decided to speak, but because you, for the first time in a long while, are finally quiet enough to listen. This growing sensitivity marks an important shift in the psychological journey. Where the first stages of withdrawal were defined by internal confrontation, facing the persona's collapse, meeting the shadow, recognizing old complexes, this stage introduces something different, a sense of connection extending beyond the isolated self. The individual begins to feel less alone in their transformation, even in complete solitude, because the world itself appears to be participating in the process. It would be a mistake to treat every coincidence during this period as profound. Discernment remains essential. Not every overlap between thought and event carries deep significance, and forcing meaning onto everything risks replacing one kind of unconsciousness with another, a superstitious reading of ordinary randomness. The meaningful synchronicities distinguish themselves by their emotional weight, by the way they seem to arrive precisely when needed, addressing exactly the question the psyche has been quietly holding. What synchronicity ultimately prepares the ground for is a deeper recognition still to come, that behind the noise of daily reactions, behind the wounds of old complexes, behind even the startling coincidences beginning to appear, there exists a guiding center within the psyche itself, one that has been present all along, waiting patiently for enough silence to finally be heard. This center is what I called the self, and its emergence is the subject we turn to next. 5. The self begins to guide your life. There is a difference I spent much of my career trying to make clear, one that most people never learn to distinguish, because ordinary life gives them no reason to. The ego is the center of consciousness, the part of you that thinks, decides, and identifies as I in daily life. It manages appointments, forms opinions, reacts to insults, and pursues goals. But the ego, for all its activity, is not the center of the entire psyche. It is only the center of what is conscious. Beneath it, encompassing it, lies something larger, something I called the self, the true center and totality of the personality, conscious and unconscious combined. The ego mistakes itself for the whole precisely because it is the only part of the psyche capable of reflecting on itself. It assumes authority it does not fully possess. It believes its preferences are the entirety of what you want, that its fears are the entirety of what threatens you, that its ambitions are the entirety of what would fulfill you. But beneath this daily governance, the self has been present all along, quieter, deeper, and considerably wiser, patiently waiting for conditions in which it might finally be heard. Those conditions rarely arise amid noise. The ego thrives on stimulation, on social feedback, on the constant external validation that confirms its chosen identity. The self operates on an entirely different frequency, one that requires stillness to detect at all. This is why, throughout history, those seeking genuine self-knowledge have so often withdrawn from society rather than toward it. Not out of misanthropy, but out of necessity. The voice of the self simply cannot compete with the volume of a crowded life. When withdrawal removes that volume, something remarkable begins to occur. Thoughts that once felt urgent, obligations that once felt vital, opinions that once felt unshakable, begin to reveal themselves as noise generated largely by the ego's need for external coherence. Beneath this noise, a quieter signal becomes perceptible, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably different in quality. It does not argue. It does not demand. It simply indicates with a strange and steady clarity what genuinely matters and what has only ever been performance. This is the voice I refer to when I speak of the self beginning to guide a life rather than merely react through it. It does not necessarily produce answers immediately, nor does it announce grand revelations on command. It works more like a compass than a map, offering direction rather than instruction, a felt sense of alignment or misalignment that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore once you have learned through solitude how to actually perceive it. Many people describe this stage as the emergence of purpose, though I would caution against understanding purpose here in the shallow sense so often marketed to the anxious and the lost. This is not a single dramatic calling revealed in a moment of inspiration. It is something quieter and more durable, a growing sense that certain directions in life resonate with something essential in you, while others, however sensible they appeared before, now feel subtly hollow. The self does not compete with the ego for control in the way two rivals might struggle for dominance. Its relationship to the ego is better understood as an invitation toward partnership. The healthy psyche does not abolish the ego, which remains necessary for functioning within ordinary reality, but it does dethrone the ego from its illusion of supremacy, allowing it instead to serve as an instrument of something larger rather than mistaking itself for the entirety of the person. This shift marks the true beginning of what I called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are rather than remaining who circumstance, conditioning, and unconscious complexes shaped you into being. Individuation is not achieved through a single insight, however powerful. It begins the moment the self is first heard clearly enough to be distinguished from the ego's noise, and it continues through a long, often uncomfortable process of integrating everything encountered along the way. The fallen persona, the confronted shadow, the recognized complexes, the noticed synchronicities. What makes this stage feel so different from those preceding it is the sensation, subtle but unmistakable, that life has begun to organize itself around something more coherent than mere survival or performance. Decisions that once felt arbitrary begin to align with an inner sense of rightness. Paths that once seemed necessary reveal themselves under the self's quiet guidance as detours from something more essential. This is not certainty in the conventional sense. It is orientation, the felt experience of finally facing the correct direction after years of wandering guided only by the ego's anxious improvisations. It is important to understand that hearing the self clearly is not the completion of the journey. It is closer to receiving for the first time an accurate compass after years of navigating by guesswork. What remains is the long work of following that direction faithfully, even when it leads somewhere the ego would never have chosen alone, into territory shaped by ancient patterns and symbols the psyche has carried for far longer than any single lifetime, the territory of the archetypes, which is precisely where our journey turns next. 6. The archetypes reshape how you see the world. As the self begins to guide rather than the ego alone, something else stirs beneath conscious awareness. Ancient patterns I called archetypes, inherited structures of the psyche, shared not by one individual or one culture, but by humanity as a whole. These are not memories in the personal sense, not experiences you lived and later forgot. They are predispositions, forms without content of their own, waiting to be filled by the particular shape of your own life, yet recognizable across every era and every civilization that has ever told a story. In solitude, these archetypes stop remaining abstract theory and begin to feel startlingly alive. The hero who must leave the familiar world behind to face an ordeal alone is not merely a figure from ancient myth. It is a pattern that awakens the moment you find yourself isolated and uncertain, facing your own shadow without anyone to rescue you from the confrontation. The sage, who offers wisdom earned through suffering rather than instruction, begins to appear not as an external figure you seek out, but as a quality slowly forming within your own reflections. The healer, who transforms wounds into meaning rather than simply erasing them, emerges precisely when old trauma stops controlling your reactions and instead becomes material you can work with consciously. These archetypal patterns do not announce themselves through direct language. They speak through image, through symbol, through the peculiar logic of dreams that grows considerably more vivid and communicative once the noise of daily distraction has quieted enough to let them surface. A person newly withdrawn from constant company often reports dreaming more intensely, more memorably than they have in years. This is not coincidence. The unconscious, finally granted enough silence to be heard, begins speaking through the only language it has ever truly possessed. Symbols that appear in this period, a particular animal, a recurring landscape, a figure who returns across several dreams in different forms, are rarely arbitrary. They are the unconscious attempting to communicate something the conscious mind has not yet found words for. Learning to sit with these images, rather than dismissing them as meaningless noise, is itself a psychological skill, one that solitude, uninterrupted by the demands of an audience, finally provides enough space to develop. I have always insisted that myth is not merely ancient superstition to be outgrown by a rational age. Myths are the accumulated psychological wisdom of humanity, encoded in narrative, because narrative was, for most of human history, the only structure capable of holding truths too complex for direct statement. When a person in withdrawal begins recognizing their own life, reflected in an old myth, the descent into the underworld, the long exile before the return, the trial that must be faced entirely alone, they are not indulging in fantasy. They are recognizing that their personal struggle participates in a pattern far older and far larger than their individual biography. This recognition changes how a person interprets their own suffering. A crisis that once felt like isolated personal misfortune begins to resemble instead a necessary stage within a pattern that has repeated itself in different forms across every human culture that has ever existed. This does not diminish the pain of the experience, but it substantially changes its meaning. Suffering endured in isolation, without any sense of larger pattern, tends toward despair. Suffering recognized as part of an ancient and universal structure tends instead toward significance. The awakening of these archetypal energies during solitude also explains why withdrawal so often produces a felt sense of transformation that ordinary language struggles to describe. The person who returns from a genuine period of isolation frequently reports feeling like a different person entirely, not because their basic personality has been erased, but because archetypal material long dormant beneath the persona's performance has finally been given room to surface and integrate into conscious identity. This process is neither comfortable nor entirely controllable. Archetypes carry immense psychic energy, and encountering them directly, rather than through the safe distance of story or myth, can feel overwhelming, even destabilizing in the moment it occurs. This is precisely why solitude functions as such fertile ground for this stage of the work. Without external distraction diluting its intensity, the individual is finally forced to engage this material directly, rather than deflecting it through constant social performance. What emerges from this engagement is not simply new information about the psyche in the abstract. It is the slow construction of a new identity, one considerably more complex and more coherent than the persona that fell away at the very beginning of this process. This new identity does not discard the ego, nor does it abolish the earlier stages of the journey. It integrates them, the fallen mask, the confronted shadow, the recognized complexes, the noticed synchronicities, the emerging self, the awakened archetypes, into something that finally begins to resemble psychological wholeness rather than a collection of fragments performing coherence. This integration is not yet complete. It is rather the final approach toward what I considered the ultimate achievement of psychological development, the full synthesis of everything encountered throughout this solitary journey into a unified, authentic personality. This synthesis is what I called individuation, and it is the culmination toward which every stage we have discussed, the fallen persona, the confronted shadow, the resolved complexes, the noticed synchronicities, the emerging self, and now the awakened archetypes, has been quietly leading all along. 7. Individuation. You return. Different. Everything I have described across this journey, the falling of the persona, the confrontation with the shadow, the loosening grip of old complexes, the strange guidance of synchronicity, the emerging voice of the self, the awakening of ancient archetypes, was never meant to stand as separate events. Each was a necessary stage within a single, continuous process I called individuation. The lifelong task of becoming the whole person you were always capable of being, rather than remaining the fragmented performance that circumstance and conditioning had assembled in your place. Individuation, properly understood, is not the achievement of perfection. It is not the elimination of flaws, nor the arrival at some final static version of yourself immune to further struggle. It is the ongoing integration of everything within the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and dark, into a coherent whole capable of holding contradiction without collapsing under its weight. A person who has undergone genuine individuation has not become simple. They have become complex in a way that no longer fragments them, but instead holds every part of who they are within a single functioning identity. This integration requires each of the pieces we have traced. The persona must fall, not disappear entirely, but lose its grip on the illusion that it constitutes your whole identity. The shadow must be met and acknowledged, not eliminated, but brought into conscious relationship rather than left to operate from hiding. The ego must be dethroned from its assumption of supreme authority, not destroyed, but repositioned as a servant to something larger, the self, which becomes, through this entire process, increasingly capable of guiding a life with genuine coherence rather than anxious improvisation. I want to be clear that this integration is rarely peaceful in the moment it occurs. Bringing the shadow into relationship with the ego creates internal tension. Allowing the self to guide decisions the ego would never have chosen alone creates uncertainty. Recognizing archetypal patterns operating beneath your personal biography can feel destabilizing, even frightening. Individuation is not comfortable work. It is, however, the only path toward a psychological wholeness that does not depend on the constant performance the persona once demanded of you. This is precisely why isolation functions as such a powerful catalyst for this process. In ordinary social life, constant distraction allows a person to avoid ever completing this integration. There is always another obligation, another performance, another distraction sufficient to postpone the deeper confrontation indefinitely. Withdrawal removes these escape routes one by one, forcing an encounter with exactly the material that constant company had always made it so easy to avoid. I have come to think of isolation, when approached consciously rather than as mere avoidance, as a genuine rite of passage, comparable to the trials that ancient cultures once built deliberately into the structure of adolescence and adulthood, periods of deliberate withdrawal designed specifically to force this kind of internal reckoning. Modern life has largely abandoned these structured rites, yet the psyche still requires something equivalent. When circumstance forces isolation upon a person, whether through loss, rejection, or simple necessity, it often unknowingly provides exactly the conditions that ritual once deliberately constructed. A rite of passage, in every culture that has practiced one, shares a common structure: separation from ordinary life, an ordeal faced largely alone, and a return transformed, no longer recognizable as the person who departed. This is precisely what genuine psychological withdrawal accomplishes, whether chosen deliberately or imposed by circumstance. The person who enters isolation carrying an intact persona, an unexamined shadow, and an ego convinced of its own supremacy does not emerge from that isolation unchanged, provided they have done the difficult work rather than simply waiting for time to pass. This is why those who have genuinely undergone this process never again perceive life quite as they did before. Having met their own shadow directly, they no longer project it so readily onto others, no longer mistake their own disowned material for someone else's malice. Having heard the self's quieter guidance, they no longer confuse the ego's anxious calculations for the entirety of their own wisdom. Having recognized archetypal patterns shaping their personal struggles, they no longer experience their suffering as isolated misfortune, but as participation in something considerably larger and more meaningful than personal biography alone. What returns from this process is not a person without wounds, without flaws, without ongoing struggle. Individuation does not promise the end of difficulty. What it offers instead is a person no longer fragmented by that difficulty, capable of holding contradiction, complexity, and even continued suffering within a coherent identity rather than being shattered by it repeatedly, as the unintegrated psyche inevitably is. This coherence is not comfort in the conventional sense. It is something considerably more valuable, stability that does not depend on circumstances remaining favorable. This, then, is what solitude ultimately offers, those willing to endure its discomfort rather than flee from it. Not merely rest from other people, and not merely escape from the demands of performance, but the rare and difficult opportunity to complete a psychological process that ordinary, distracted life makes nearly impossible to finish. Those who emerge from genuine withdrawal do not simply feel different. They have become, in the truest sense I ever attempted to describe, someone considerably more whole than the person who first stepped away from the noise. Every stage of this journey, the falling of the persona, the confrontation with the shadow, the loosening of old complexes, the quiet arrival of synchronicity, the emerging voice of the self, the awakening of the archetypes, and finally, individuation itself, points toward a single truth I spent my life trying to make undeniable. You cannot become whole while remaining constantly available to everyone but yourself. Withdrawal is not abandonment of the world. It is the return to the one relationship most people spend an entire lifetime avoiding, the relationship with their own psyche. What waits for you in that silence is not emptiness. It is everything you were always meant to become. If this resonated with something in you, if some part of you recognized itself in this journey through the shadow and toward the self, then you already know this is not the end of your own process, only the beginning of paying attention to it. Subscribe to the channel because what comes next will take you even deeper into the territories the psyche guards most carefully. And tell me in the comments, at which stage of this journey you recognized yourself the most: the falling mask, the encounter with the shadow, or the quiet arrival of the self. I will be reading, and I will see you in the next one.